Hi, everyone. My name is Heather Turner. I am a Merrimack Score mentor in New Hampshire and also a New Hampshire small business owner. And today I'd like to talk to you about volunteer recognition and encouragement, something that we all try to do, but sometimes we can do better every day. So, in years of being both a volunteer and also managing volunteers and also large groups of volunteers, I've learned a lot of life lessons about what works and what doesn't work. So, I'm going to talk about a few things that I've picked up. I wish I had a lot more time than 20 minutes or so to talk about this. I am going to be following up with a handout that has some links with some additional places to check out. But if you walk away with one thing that you've picked up from this, it makes it all worthwhile. And I hope throughout this conference that you'll learn many more things that you can take back to your organizations. Now, I'd like you to think about what your volunteer lifetime value is. Now, if you've been in business, you might have heard customer lifetime value. But think about this from a volunteer perspective. Your volunteer lifetime value means that you have spent time training that volunteer. And if you think of it as a business perspective, how much harder is it to get new business versus getting repeat business, getting those return customers? It's just about exactly the same in the volunteer perspective. It's so much harder to get new volunteers than retain existing volunteers. It really helps when you're thinking about this to put an actual dollar value on this time. When you get a new volunteer before they're released into the wilds of volunteering, it generally takes some time, both your time, maybe staff members, maybe other volunteers that they might work with, to actually train that volunteer to get them adjusted to whatever you're doing. So that is all based into that lifetime volunteer value. So it's worded several different ways. So I've seen it LVV, I've seen it volunteer lifetime value. There's no wrong way to look at this. But think of this from the perspective of retention is so much easier than getting that new volunteer. And recognition is such a humongous part of that. Now, one of the things that many of us don't really think about is why does each person volunteer for something? What is their carrot? Now, just like in anything, what is everybody's carrot? What drives them? What motivates them? There is no one size fits all to that. And that's important if you are organizing volunteer groups or you're even organizing just a one on one volunteer experience, is to understand what drives and what motivates the volunteer or volunteers that you're working with. And we can't know that. You can't just look at a person and say, I understand what your carrot is, I understand what motivates you and what drives you. But having those conversations with people helps you get a good perspective on someone. It also helps you get a good perspective on what types of recognition works better. Not many people are necessarily motivated by actual tangible gifts. They're always nice things to be rewarded with, but some people are more motivated by additional praise. Some people are motivated by certain types of wording. But having conversations with those volunteers, and especially new volunteers, but most especially those experienced volunteers, if you've never had a conversation with them about what motivates them to volunteer, you won't know. And you won't know how best to retain them too. So that's such an important question to have, an important conversation to have with your volunteers. Now, some people think tangible gifts are fantastic, and if your organization's budget can afford that, tangible gifts are fantastic. But think about it, is it better to give cut flowers, for example? Well, cut flowers are expensive, but unfortunately, they don't last. From a price perspective, you could buy a plant that's still going to continue to grow, maybe a little pot of violets, and give it to a volunteer with a little handwritten thank you note. And that is a gift that will last them for a while. They can look at that plant and think, geez, that was thanks that I got for volunteering for something. But again, you don't necessarily have to use things that are tangible. But if you're giving them things, if you're just giving them swag, if you want to call it that, is this something that is actually valuable to them? Is that something that they will really take and use? Will that be something that they feel appreciated really long term? So before just buying stuff for people, Ask them if it's actually even things that they're going to use. So if you're going to buy me a stress ball, I might use a stress ball. But if you're going to buy me a fancy dancy soap holder for my shower, I probably may not use it because I already have one. If you're going to give people actual gifts, try to strive for those ones that are functional. Something else to think about is if you're going to give things like edibles. So, cake pops are fantastic. I personally love them. I try not to eat too many because that adds to the little bit of the waistline, but they're also expensive. But they're also not a very meaningful gift. So I volunteered a few years ago, and the volunteer organizer did a very nice thing. She actually had gone to the dollar store and bought these cute little jars, went next door to Michael's and got some nice fancy ribbon, and filled jars with M&Ms, and did these cute little hand-printed notes for all of them. And it meant so much to all of us that volunteered that we knew that realistically, from the dollar value of the gift, it was only a couple dollars each. But it was the very fact that she took the time to do that and took the time to give us those gifts that meant so much to all of us. So think about the time that people will see that you spend on something, especially if it's a tangible gift. Now, how to give people recognition and have them hear it, have them see it. Most organizations have social media channels, at least they have Facebook, if nothing else, but many of them have Twitter, they have Instagram, they have Pinterest, they have YouTube, they have LinkedIn personal and business profiles. What better way to thank, and it's free as well, you don't have to spend the money on the ads, is thank your volunteers on social media. If you really want to do something a little bit unique, record a short video from maybe the organizer of the organization or the president of the organization or maybe the board of directors, saying a personalized thank you to volunteers. But make sure that you name people individually, whether it's in recognition in print, whether it's in audio or any other format. The wonderful thing about using social media to thank volunteers is people do love to see their name in print. And from a marketing standpoint, they do tend to share it on their own social media channels. So it's also spreading the love about your organization out there. But if you're using social media for your organization, please take advantage of it. It only takes a few minutes to develop posts, but those people that you are thanking, especially individually, it really means a lot. Now, if you have access to your website, even if you're using a professional website developer, maybe you have a blog, for example, but adding a page if you can, or even if it's just a blog post, recognizing the help of volunteers, recognizing the work that they've done is so very important. And it's such an easy way to grant recognition to people. Personal thank you notes. Yes, they are time consuming, but boy, they pay off. Anytime that I have tried to run anything with the volunteers, I spend the time to write thank you notes. And I know that it pays off because guaranteed every single person that I sent a thank you note to either emails me or calls me or texts me and says, "Thank you for sending the thank you note. That was really surprising." And those are the people that come back and volunteer time after time. Not that they know that I'm going to send them a thank you note, or maybe I'll send them something interesting that they can actually use, not necessarily a big dollar value, but it's again the fact, just like putting those M&Ms in a jar, that I spent the time to do that. So think about this. Those pay off. And if it seems, wow, this is a really time consuming thing to do, think back to the beginning where I talked about that lifetime volunteer value. How much harder is it to recruit new volunteers, and how much time is it going to take you to do that versus the time that it's spent to write 15 thank you cards or even 150 thank you cards? Because if you're writing 150 thank you cards to 150 volunteers and you lose half of them because you don't appreciate them, how many more hours is it going to take you to recruit that half of 150? That's a lot of time. So if you start to put that time you spend doing back into volunteer appreciation and recognition, it really does pay off, and it is much more time efficient to do that. Okay. Writing press releases is another one. And I will make sure that with the handout that I'm sending follow-upping this, that there's some free press release sites that you can submit press releases to. But most of the local papers will also take press releases. Press releases don't take a long time to print up and write up, and sending them out to local papers, again, people love to see their name in print. Adding those press releases just out there, and you can also add them to your website. If you want to attract new volunteers, they found that one of the better benefits and the better ways to attract volunteers are for people to see that you're actually putting out and thanking your current volunteers. And I'll use myself as a perfect example of this. If I'm going to go volunteer for an organization, one of the things that maybe not consciously I think about, but I know in hindsight that I have certainly had an effect on whether I actually pick up the phone or send an email to do this, is whether I'm actually seeing them do volunteer appreciation online anywhere. When I Google that organization, is there a press release coming up that says, thank you to our volunteers for spending time at the food shelf, for example? Making sure that that's out there online, because people do search for volunteer experiences and opportunities. But the more press that you can get and the more you can put out there that you are currently thanking volunteers, the more that will come back to you, especially in terms of new acquisition. Okay, this is something that is so important in terms of listening. Now, we all try to work on this. Some of us say we're good listeners, some of us really are good listeners. But I would ask you, the next time you talk to a volunteer, whether it's one on one or in a group situation, get a timer for yourself and time yourself. How much time have you spent talking, and how much time have you actually spent listening? This is so important if you're ever talking to a volunteer that has something that's important that they need to talk to you about. So maybe they have an issue with a situation, maybe they have a concern that needs to be addressed. And it's so important to mirror back what they say, to say to them that you're actually listening to them. So if I heard someone say to me, well, I'm not really comfortable working in this environment. I don't feel it's very safe. For example, maybe they were working in a city downtown. It was evening and maybe the crime rate was particularly high, just as an example of this. If someone voiced a concern like that to me, it's best if I mirror that back to them and I say, I heard you. I hear you say you feel uncomfortable and unsafe in this environment. Let them know that you are listening. Because even if you listen and you don't follow back up with that mirroring, the conception that a lot of people have is, I've voiced my concerns to you, but I don't know whether you actually heard them, and especially whether you're going to take action about doing something about that. So when you're mirroring someone and reflecting back what they're telling you, make sure you follow up with something, a plan of action. You're going to fix it. You're going to take action on it. You're going to report it to someone. You're going to change something. Give them something actionable that they can take away so it feels like it was worth their time to talk to you about something. Okay. Now, respect is something that we all try to strive for as well, but we do also do have to remember that people come to us as volunteers from all backgrounds, from all knowledge levels, from every walk of life, and all of them have something to contribute. If we're not respecting them, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their age, no matter their gender, we are not respecting what they are saying. So when we're listening and we're mirroring, make sure that that's a big part of your toolkit in listening, especially, and respecting, but also in what we're talking to them about. And this is particularly hard when we come from certain backgrounds, for example. So that I know as an American, sometimes we use slang that can be taken the wrong way in other countries, an example of this. And this is something that we need to be cognizant of and aware of. I've heard people from down south, for example, have certain mannerisms and sayings, but as New Englanders, some of us might take offense of that. So if you have something that you're talking about to a group, it might be best, and you are unsure of their backgrounds, you're unsure of how they're going to take things, it might be best to actually kind of talk about what you're going to say in advance and review it. Because I have seen some volunteer groups where the volunteer organizer has talked to them And certain things have come across them, unfortunately, in a negative or an unhappy way, or people just have a takeaway that they didn't necessarily mean to have from something. Okay. Now, you've gone ahead, you've thanked your volunteers for recognition, you've done a lot to try to publicize them, to say thank you as much as possible. Now, it's not just a one and done. You're not just done at that point. If you really want to retain those volunteers and to keep appreciating them, it is nice to send the occasional thank you for still being a volunteer for the organization, but also think about just touching base with them occasionally. Put that post it note up on your computer or wherever you're going to see it frequently, and just make sure that you touch base with them. Hey, how are you? Are you planning on coming to our next event? Is there anything that we can do from you? Are you doing okay? That touching base is a touch point, and think of it as a touch point. Okay. Now, speaking of touch points, it's so important when you're touching base with your volunteers, especially when you're following up on something that they have volunteered for, to give your appreciation, to give the thank you to them. Always try to do at least 2 touch points and always do it one to one. I volunteered in so many organizations where there's a mass email that goes out to all the volunteers thanking them. And that's fantastic. I appreciate the fact that they do that. But those ones that follow up one on one with those individual emails, and I know from the perspective of the organizers and the managers, these again are time consuming. But even if you just write something up and then you personalize it and you cut and you paste it into each email, but you still take that time to personalize it a little bit with their name and maybe add one extra sentence to it, that one on one standpoint is always so important. Now, this is important to dial back to the beginning to talk about the carrot. It's also important to find out how people best communicate. Now, a few years ago, when we were volunteering in an organization down in Connecticut, we had a gentleman who I think was in his mid 70s. If you emailed him, he wouldn't respond. If you called him, he wouldn't respond. But if you texted him, he'd respond right away. Now, we never know how people prefer to communicate until we ask them. So you can have Zoom meetings one on one, you could have group meetings, you could have emails, you could have cell phone texts, and you can pick up the phone and call. But again, try to make sure that you especially try to do those one on one touch points. Saying thank you individually means so much more than that mass email or that mass group text that just goes out to everybody. I mean, even a mass Zoom call is great if you're going to particularly recognize someone, but it still dilutes the actual appreciation and thank you that you give people. Now, the one thing that I would task all of you to do is to try to say thank you as much as you can. Now, it is funny because when I've talked to organizers, I always make a point of asking them to ask themselves when really, really, really was the last time that you said thank you to the people that have volunteered for you? And how many times? Again, did you say it as a group? Did you send it as a mass email out to everybody? When was the last time that you touched base one on one with a volunteer and said, thank you for your work? Thank you for your service. We appreciate you. Those sticky notes are great for reminders if you need to, but please make sure that you use those 2 words as much as you can, because those people take those 2 words more than anything tangible that you can give them, and they will return over and over. The ones that don't hear that, whether it's verbally, audio, or whether it's online anywhere, those are the ones that are probably not going to come back, because realistically, everybody has different carrots, but that's a cookie. And cookies work much better than carrots in a lot of different situations. Thank you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your conference.